Hi, Glenys.
Hey, Aaron. What do you want to talk about today?
How much I hate diets.
Yeah, diets suck.
So what do you do instead of a diet?
Intuitive eating. Health at every size.
So how many times have you had to explain intuitive eating and health at every size to someone?
Like 5,000 times. But that was just to my doctor.
Okay, so how many times have you explained it to someone and then they said, but diets are the only thing I know?
That's like every time. Can we pursue health without thinking about weight?
Yes, we can pursue health without thinking about weight.
That's pretty revolutionary, what you just said. But what if you just don't like yourself at the size that you're at?
I think we need to understand why, instead of just saying I need to change.
So, what's the deal with body positivity?
Oh man, that's a long answer. I'm Aaron Flores.
And I'm Glenys Oyston. And we are Dietitians Unplugged. Hey everybody, welcome back. This is Glenys. I'm here with Aaron, my awesome podcast partner. How's it going?
Super good, Glenys. Awesome to talk to you again.
Yeah. I'm
trying
excited.
out a new radio voice. And that was going to be it. Hey, Glenys. How's it going?
Hi. It's like NPR, but like without the coffee. I don't know.
Right. As our downloads go to like 0 with that stupid new voice. Yeah, I'm not doing that.
We used to love that podcast, and we don't know what happened to Aaron's voice, but
Aaron? Oy, I snorted. Sorry about that, everybody.
Awesome. It's at least a one snort podcast today. Well, we are so, you know why we're giddy? Because we are super excited to have Jes Baker, the militant baker, author of some awesome books, most recently Landwhale, on our podcast today, to talk about body liberation and all sorts of other stuff. And I think that's why we're giddy. Would you agree?
I would agree 100%. This is, Jes, I first met her at a conference she put up for lay folks in probably like, I would say 5 years ago. It's what first sort of got me the idea of doing like a talk on Star Wars and health at every size and intuitive eating. So it was where all of this came from. So
yeah. I would say too, like I remember like we were friends back then. And you had been my preceptor just a year or two before that. And you came back from that conference and you were telling me about it. And you had gone through this, like, just I could see it, like a major shift. And you're like, I just want to get on the rooftops and shout about this stuff. And that's when we started talking about doing something together. And then that's when this podcast was born. So really, Jes Baker might be responsible for this podcast.
I think we should just be careful to say that because now, if we get any revenue, do we owe Jes Baker like a portion of that revenue? Yeah. Jes, see where my mind goes? Sorry. Yeah. We make zero money off this, by the way. But anyway, no, I agree. I think that I remember that very vividly, sort of coming home and being, having this idea that like I can't quite keep this information to myself anymore. And I think actually, it's an interesting thing just to spend a couple minutes on this is I think that's something I still think about pretty often is like, how do I communicate these things to a larger audience? And I think whether it's this podcast or whether it's, social media or even just working with more clients or even doing more sort of audacious speaking, I think that has been a recurring theme since that conference. So thank you for sort of helping me remember that.
Yeah, I just remember. And I remember thinking like, oh, great. Is there going to be another one? And then I don't know that there was another one, so I didn't get to go. But right. Maybe someday in the future. But it sounded fabulous. And you just came back aglow and ready to do. I mean, I think that's really when your work, you really pivoted a little bit in your work. And so that's why.
Well, thank you, Jes.
Yeah. And, I read her first book, Things No One Will Tell Fat Girls, a few years ago. And, read Landwhale, and just super excited to have her on.
Yeah.
Well, let me read her.
Yeah, I'll read her bio, and then we'll hop in to our discussion with Jes. Jes Baker is a positive, progressive, and magnificently irreverent force to be reckoned with in the realm of self-love, advocacy, and mental health. She is internationally known for preaching the importance of body liberation, hard conversation, strong coffee, and even stronger language. Jes burst onto the body image scene when she created her own ads mocking Abercrombie and Fitch for discriminating against all body types, a move that landed her on the Today Show and garnered a loyal following for her raw, honest, attitude-filled blog missives. When not writing, Jes spends her time speaking around the world, working in behavioral health, teaching amazing humans on how to harness their power around body image and mental health, taking pictures in her underwear, attempting to convince her cats that they like to wear bow ties. You can read Jes's writing at themilitantbaker.com and learn more about her coaching at jesbaker.com. We were both so astounded and pleased that she actually agreed to be on our podcast. So without too much ado, here is our discussion with Jes Baker. I hope you enjoy it. Well, this is a great day in podcast history for us on Dietitians Unplugged. Glenys and I are really excited to welcome Jes Baker on the show. Jes, thanks so much for taking time and talking to us.
Oh my God, it's an honor. Thank you for having me.
We're so excited to have you here. This has been a long held dream for us.
Yeah, I didn't really sleep last night, so because I was excited. Anyways, instead of me fanboying for the whole 1 hour, which no one wants to listen to. Let's just sort of dive in. And one of the things that I know a lot of folks would like to hear about is just a little bit of, give us an idea of how you came to this work, how you started doing all of this, and how your career in this has evolved over time.
Yeah. Well, I think I forget this because it was about 6 or 7 years ago, but kind of why I'm here today on this podcast with you is an accident. I've always blogged, and I don't know if you guys remember, during the live journal days, there was also a not as cool live journal called Zanga. Did you guys ever hear about that?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I wrote on Zanga through my whole, through college. That's kind of what kept me alive, was writing. So when I came back from college, it was then Blogger. And I was, chronicling my life. I was a baker at the time professionally. So I was doing recipes and all that. And this is my origin story is the same every time, but I found this blog called the Nearsighted Owl, and it was written by someone named Rochelle. She lived in Portland, and it really blew my mind because it was the first time I had ever seen a fat woman who was happy, fulfilled, married. We liked very similar things. We had purple beehives and thrifting and cats and owls and all of that. And when I discovered that blog, it just was really transformative. And I won't lie, the first time I saw it, it was very jarring. I think that's really common for a lot of folks is when we're so used to seeing fat people portrayed as sad or to be pitied or horrible in, villainous ways. Seeing somebody who was fat and happy and just living their life was really radical and kind of strange. So it was kind of like a train wreck. I didn't really want to look because it was making me feel something very uncomfortable. I wasn't sure how to process it, but I kept going back. And eventually I realized that if Rochelle could, live this life as a fat person, I probably could too. And so that's when my blog shifted from baking to kind of body image. And I did the same thing I did in college. I chronicled my journey and I was real honest about it. And I thought that was important, just to be really open. And somehow it kind of took off. I think people crave honesty, right?
Mm-hmm. Totally. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And through that was, I had enough of a following that when the Abercrombie and Fitch comments came out, I think that's where people are like, you look familiar, but I don't know where from. That's maybe where they've seen me. So the Abercrombie and Fitch debacle, where the quotes came out from the CEO that said, fat people, they don't want to wear any of their clothes for exclusivity reasons. And I did a photo shoot to counter that. So I made a faux Abercrombie ad where I was plus size, half naked. The funniest thing about Abercrombie to me is that they sell clothes, but they're usually half naked in all of their ads.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
So like, you know,
Yeah. They're not really selling clothes.
No,
they're selling
definitely not
objectification.
Absolutely. So you don't even have to wear their clothes to pretend to be in one of their ads, is my point. So you can just get half naked and call it an Abercrombie ad. And that definitely went on the Today Show and then all over the world. And I was so grateful to have that kind of visibility. So that's what started what now is 7 years, I think, of doing body image work online. I personally love the term body liberation. I know that a lot of people talk about different things, body love, body positivity. I used to use those words. I identify with body liberation now. And the reason I like that is because I feel like body positivity is kind of an unachievable goal, or body love. It's kind of asking us to fall in love with our bodies unconditionally and have like this sordid affair. And I tried that for a long time and it was just exhausting. I never quite got to that point where I could look in the mirror every day and just be like, you know what? You're fucking gorgeous, Jes.
Agreed.
And yeah.
Tiring.
And I was like, you know, I'm failing at this new goal that's supposed to be freeing from the old goal. And I'm still caught in this like failure of achieving the unachievable. So
yeah,
body liberation.
I find that body positivity too is this thing that was more hung on women than men. Like I don't know any man that has ever been expected to go like be totally in love with his body. I mean, that's a broad generalization because of course men are suffering from eating disorders and all sorts of things now. But in general, speaking in generalities, I think that this is sort of, as women, we're supposed to look in the mirror and, like you said, find ourselves really hot or something. And it's like, is that really necessary?
And I actually think that, you know, it's a transition, right? This whole thing is kind of like a stepping stone after stepping stone process. That's what I've seen in the years that I've been doing it. It's what I've seen in myself and other people. So we have to start somewhere. And body love and body positivity, I think, is important. That very like palatable pastel Instagram stuff because it gets us in the door. And I think that's important because the actual like nitty gritty of what we talk about when we talk about liberation of bodies and oppression and social justice is actually quite terrifying when we start to really dig. So I think those things are important. It got me to where I am today, but I've really just moved to this point where I think, you know, your fat friend is an essayist online and a friend of mine. And she wrote something very, very brilliant recently in a tweet because she's great at summarizing. And it was like, you know, when we talk about fatness, it's really difficult because it's not, for me, I'm not trying to love my body. I'm trying to talk about systemic oppression. And, you know, you just want me to look in the mirror and say you look beautiful. I'm summarizing. And so that's kind of the transition I made was in the last 2 or 3 years, really, as I was writing my last memoir, Landwhale, I was like, wow, things have really shifted for me since my first book, which was Things What No One Will Tell Fat Girls. My goals have shifted. And so now for me, you know, I'm kind of working in a body liberation space. And what that means to me is that, you know, this can look any way you want. You and your relationship with your body and then your relationship with your life. It could look a million different ways, and that's okay. It's all about people having all of the knowledge. That's my goal in life, to give people the knowledge that maybe they don't get from society. So it's not so one-sided, and hopefully everything in between, and then letting people make an educated decision of what's great for them. I think the danger is when we only have one perspective, the one that we get from the media, from society, from our system structures. And so I'm just here to offer education on all the other options and then let people make that choice. Does that make sense?
Totally.
I'd like to just follow up on the liberation part of it for a second, and then also about this idea of the transition. But to me, when I hear liberation and compared to positivity or body love, to me, liberation sounds more inclusive. And I'm wondering if that resonates with you at all. I feel like liberation can fit a lot of different body types, a lot of different genders, a lot of different body stories. And I'm wondering if that's any part of that for you as well, Jes.
Absolutely. I've made a lot of mistakes, like endless mistakes. Actually, I still do. Today, I'll probably make 100. One that I really learned from was I started this conference. Aaron, I think you're familiar.
Yeah.
I started this conference, and the first year I came up with what I thought was a brilliant tagline. And it was change the world, not your body. And I was like, ooh, this is clever and catchy. I'm gonna use this and brand it. And I had the greatest of intentions. I really did. I had no business making a conference. I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't really understand intersectionality and like how to be inclusive really, but I was enthusiastic. And so I went with it. And I kind of sat down with some professors from the University of Arizona here in Tucson, where I live, and sat down, and we had, the U of A put together this great, drinks to have together. And I had some feedback from them. And their feedback, the first thing they said was, I went to your website and it's very exclusive. And I was like, how is this possible, right? My little baby brain. And they were like, as trans folks, a couple of the professors there were working in that area as professors at the U of A. And they were like, as trans folks in this world, telling me to not change my body is incredibly limiting and harmful and exclusionary. And I was like, holy fuck, like this didn't cross my very privileged white cisgender mind, So that blew my mind. And I was like, wow, so what else am I missing? So the liberation part, the liberation for me is completely open. And whenever we use like sentences like not or don't or should never, like I feel like that is going to inherently exclude a lot of people. So liberation for me means you can change your body, you cannot change your body, you can do nothing with your body, you can, if I had this fascinating experience where I saw and met someone who was coping with sobriety and like really changing their life through engaging in diet culture. And that was a total mind fuck. But in order for them to stay sober, they really need to have that control somewhere else. And so it really challenges that concept of like, can diet culture be helpful? So for me, liberation is completely open. It is applicable to everyone. And that's why it does look a million different ways. Because we're all here just trying to do the best we can, be as happy as we can, as free as we can within this world that we live in. And that's really what I want to promote for people.
So we've been reading your book, Landwhale, sorry. Like, it's also morning for me. We talked about this. Like, not a morning person.
One cup of coffee doesn't do it.
We've been reading your book, Landwhale, and it's awesome. And I read your previous book as well. And I can definitely see like the evolution of your sort of philosophy, which has been great. But one thing that really stood out for me, which has been great because a lot of my clients say this to me too, is that you'd always imagined yourself as a fat person your whole life. Like I was a fat kid. And then you talked about how you realized all of a sudden that you weren't a fat child for at least part of your childhood. I'm wondering, did that change how you saw the story of your body?
That's actually a really phenomenal question. And I've asked myself everything about this topic except that question.
Okay. You're welcome.
Did it change the story around?
Great job, Glenys.
Yeah. Yes. I think for me, it really reinforced. So, ultimately, for those people who haven't read it, which is most people in the world, I thought I grew up a fat kid, and I very distinctly remember having these experiences of living in a fat body as a child that were incredibly shameful and harmful. And I really, entered the body image world, this work as the militant baker, Jes Baker, or whatever, with that, idea that I've been fat my whole life, and this is what it's like to live in a fat body. And then I went to write this book because I literally pitched a chapter called I Was a Fat Kid. And I went to my mom's house and looked through some photo books. I grew up Mormon, so scrapbooking is a big deal. So we have lots of scrapbooks. And I was flipping through pages, and starting at the beginning of my life, I really as a baby, I was maybe slightly chunky, but that's very normal for babies. And then I was thin all the way up until puberty. And it blew my mind for a lot of reasons. One, I distinctly remember being a fat child. So how is that possible? And also the weirdest thing is that, I had looked at these scrapbooks before, like within the last 5 years while I've been doing this work. And I still somehow like visually superimposed a fat body onto old photos. And so what that really reinforced for me is how harmful fatphobia, hating fatness is, because that influenced me in really traumatic ways, even though I wasn't fat, right? So you don't have to be fat for fatphobia to really, really harm you. And also it really made me question, how we look at photos of ourselves and how we look in the mirror. And like, what's the neuropsychology behind that? Why are we so triggered? Or why do we see something that's not there? So those two things really came up for me when I kind of had to check myself on my history, because really I didn't start getting chubby and fat until puberty.
Yeah, that's so interesting, because I've had many clients say that to me that have, eating disorders and extreme disordered eating and weight cycling. And they said my mom or whoever, my family member, put me on a diet when I was really young. And then they go back and I said, and were you even a fat child? And they have gone back and looked at pictures and they were like, no, I was not. Mm-hmm. But somebody perceived that they were, and they perceived that they were. I mean, not that only, I'm not saying fat children should be put on diets. Nobody should be put on diets as children, especially. Right. But it's just, it's just interesting. Like you said, fat phobia hurts everybody, and not just everyone. Fat people.
Absolutely. And I think that's like the most important thing that I wish that people would recognize, is that, we see a lot of aversion to challenging fat phobia, from thin folks sometimes, because it's difficult and hard to look at. But it's really so worth the investment of discomfort and maybe pain of looking at, how we see ourselves and see others, because as long as fat folks are discriminated against, all bodies are going to struggle with. And I don't think we really truly realize how deeply ingrained and how harmful it is. Everything from the way we interact with like our friends and our family and our partners, to how we eat, to how we move, to how we, apply for a job. It's all affected by how we kind of show up in the world. So it's really beneficial for everyone for us to get rid of fat phobia in general forever.
Right.
Small goal, let's just eradicate fat phobia, guys.
Yeah. Yes. We'll do that by the end of this podcast.
Yeah, I just came up with that right now. Isn't that a brilliant idea? It's not like people have been doing this forever. Yeah, that's the goal.
I think one of the things that you do very intentionally, obviously, to challenge that fat phobia is in the title of your book. Calling your second memoir a Landwhale is, it started out as an insult, right? And you're turning that now sort of on its head. It's almost like using the word fat. Right. I'm going to use these, what someone might have said to me as an insult before, now is the title of my book. Because I use the word fat a lot, and a lot of people struggle with just that part of it. For you, can you explain a little bit about the importance of words and changing the how we think of these words as a part of liberation?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot of people who don't like to call themselves fat, even if they're, considered socially fat, which is kind of a hard line to distinguish, but I'm kind of talking about like plus size. For me, it was so incredibly powerful to use the word fat. And that's kind of what I really started with in the beginning of doing this work for myself and in the world. Was the worst thing you could call me, I owned it. And I think reclaiming words is really powerful for two reasons. One, it takes the weapon away from people who try to throw it at you. And two, it really makes you dig into why is that word so negative and what does it actually mean. And for me, fat is just a very neutral way to describe a body, a size of a body with a lot of fat on it, right? And there's not really another word for that. The word obesity is very pathologizing at others, and it's used in clinical terms as a very negative thing. And overweight doesn't make any sense to me, because over what weight? There's a lot of diversity in bodies, and I guess you could say not thin, but that doesn't count either. So fat it is, and fat was something that I really embraced early on, and I'm so glad I did. I learned a lot about it, and Landwhale was just kind of an extension of that. Growing up, I live in Tucson, Arizona. It's very hot here in the summer. I did swim team for the majority of my life until college, and the scariest thing, and I love water, of course, because I live in the desert, so I'm just obsessed with water, oceans, pools, you name it. The worst thing I can remember is just like being at swim team or being in a pool and trying to lift yourself out by your arms and like not quite making it, that could happen to anyone depending on arm strength and a million different things. But being called a beached whale, or look at that whale, or being called a land whale was such a fear of mine as a kid. And it's also like a go-to for a lot of trolls online. So I was like, oh, guess what? Whales are absolutely fucking amazing. And I did a lot of research for a very short chapter that was all about the animal names I've been called and why those animals are awesome. And so that was kind of a fun way to reclaim something that also used to be weaponized against me and flip it on its head and be like, you know what? Literally, whales are one of the coolest creatures on this planet. Pigs are so smart. Cows celebrate, experience joy. Do you know how cool elephants are? Like, let's talk about this. So that was a very short part of Landwhale, but I think the message of really reclaiming those words, learning about them, and moving on can be such a powerful thing for a lot of people.
I totally agree. I think I love that part too, where you're sort of like looking at the stories of these animals and how we revere these animals in society in many ways. And so sort of owning that part of that narrative, I think is really helpful for people to sort of wrap their head around the language that is meant, is hurled as insults, what it means when we are able to flip that narrative. Yeah.
I don't think it's always so easy. I think, we have in our brain, when people talk about being hardwired, it's a great way to say it, because our natural inclination is very hard to override. Mm-hmm. And so it's scary in the beginning to look at those words, to use them, to say them, to write about them. And I've been in a lot of places lately for a couple trainings where it's not, body image related. And I've used the word fat, and watching people's reactions, like, really interesting, because they're like, oh, please don't say that about yourself, And so it's a weird thing to do in our society. But I think that it is also incredibly powerful. And the more we do it, the more we do override that learned behavior or learned association. And so it really starts to change the way we see ourselves and other people. It's worth it. And it's a very simple thing to do, right? Start using the one word that scares you the most.
Yeah. It scares a lot of other people too, because I was in the grocery store the other day and I ran into, one of my coworkers, lovely person. I don't think she really knows what my thing is, my thing being this podcast and anti-weight loss and all of that. And we were just talking about our jobs, because she's transitioning job. And I just said, oh, I'm so happy in my job. I never have to do weight loss, because I mostly work with, aside from my private practice, I work with elderly people. Their biggest problem is involuntary weight loss. So, and then I kind of looked at her, I said, who wants to ask a fat dietitian how to lose weight? And I was kind of joking, right? But at the same time, her face just kind of crumpled, and then she looked like kind of like horrified on my behalf. And I was like, oh yeah, you aren't okay with that term like I am. And my bubble popped, and I was like, oh, I'm out in the world, okay. And it was like, but I was like, okay, but maybe I've just introduced you. Maybe she'll think like, oh, poor Glenys thinks of herself that way. But hopefully we'll have a future conversation about that. Whereas I like to drop bombs on people sometimes, like, boom, fat.
I love the fat dietitian too. I think that is such a odd thing for people to like comprehend. Like they don't have a framework for that. They're
Yeah.
like, what do you mean? All dietitians are very thin,
Right.
able-bodied, and white. And so I love that you're challenging that, both of you. Absolutely.
There is, I think, fat dietitians face discrimination, so it's important for us to sort of open up that conversation, which we do here. But yeah, I just what you've written about and like taking back sort of the name, and it's like, yeah, I'm totally okay with fat, and then somebody's face crumples. You're like, oh, I forgot. Not everybody is, but it's a liberating feeling for me.
Yes, and it's a fascinating experience.
It is, and listen, I think I owe a lot of credit to you, Jess, for that, because I think that just thinking about my own journey, at your conference was the first time I said like, oh, I'm a fat dietitian, because it was a part of my presentation, and I remember sitting there like writing a proposal and having this idea, and I'm like, is this okay to like put, in the in the title, right, that I'm a fat dietitian, and I was like, well, of course I'm going to this. Like, if I can't do it at this conference, like, where else could I do it?
Yeah.
So I mean, that's a lot of credit to what you have done and what you helped create, and I think it helped in my process, but I'm sure it helped in many other people's as well.
I'm glad to hear that. I think it's really important to talk about like where we kind of learned about this stuff from,
Absolutely.
A lot of times with social media, we get really caught up in like the here and now and who's popping up all over the internet right now. But there's so much legacy work that's been done, since like the late 60s, Fat Underground, and a lot of this work has been going on for a really long time. And so I'm also really grateful for the books, the zines, the writing that's come far before me, that has allowed for even this space for us to talk today happen. And so thank you for sharing that with me. And I'm also really grateful for other people who've given me the same permission.
Well, let's not let that slip by for a second, right? Like, who are some of those folks that, like, again, we're talking about an evolution of your career and how you're doing this over 6-7+ years. Who are those early influencers for you?
I have to say the person that's most consistently inspiring me that I look to, because when you're very visible online, I think you get a lot of feedback that's all over the place, and I really struggled for a long time of how to sort through it. Like I literally was being told, everything, the opposites, everything in between, and I was like, what does this even mean about what I'm doing, and who do I listen to? And I learned through trial and error and a lot of other smart people that, really to look to the people that you see changing the world in amazing ways, and check in and see how you're doing when it comes to how they show up in the world. And the person for me, and I will say this every time, all the time, is Sonia Renee Taylor. Mm-hmm. Sonia Renee Taylor lives in New Zealand, but used to live in the Bay Area, and is the founder of The Body Is Not an Apology, and also just wrote a book by the same name, and is probably the most amazing human on this planet. I think Sonia and like LeVar Burton are like the only two perfect humans on this planet. And I'm so grateful they live with us at this day and age. And so Sonia's really influenced me in every way. So I have to give a lot of that to her. And I think it's also important to mention that, body liberation and body positivity, the pastel stuff, is all derivative of fat acceptance movement that started in the late 60s, early 70s. And it wasn't about finding yourself beautiful. It wasn't about fitting in to society standards. It was about, bucking the trend, and also civil liberties and civil rights. It was about people not dying from, stigma in medical situations where people go in when they have something very, they have some sort of illness unrelated to fatness or their weight, and then they're prescribed a diet and it goes undiagnosed. People die from this. People also die from having weight loss surgery and all of these other things that happen to fat folks because there's so much stigma. Access to spaces. There's so many different things we don't think about when it comes to bodies, and that is what this movement was started as. And so I may have started in the love your body section, and that's okay. I think we have to start somewhere, right? We don't go from 1 to 180 in a second. I started in that, but now I've kind of come to this place where I realize that, anti-Blackness and fatness are inextricably connected. So if we're going to look at fatphobia, we also have to look at race and racial discrimination and all of that, and how all of these things are very intertwined. And it sounds very wordy and a little scary and very political, and it is political and kind of hard to listen to. But the cool thing is, and I'll just bring this back, is that it starts with us. And I think that, we could look at this entire, intersection of body liberation and get overwhelmed and say, well, oh my God, I don't know if I can handle, addressing ability, disability, and classism and poverty and racism and, all of this stuff and fatphobia. But what we can do for first steps is really start with ourselves. And this is something that Sonia talks about, is the way we interact with the world is because of how we feel about our bodies and then consequently other people's bodies. So if we want to kind of change the way we interact with people, we need to change the way we view ourselves. So doing that personal work to really challenge stereotypes, stigma, all those scary things, starting to learn how to have some compassion and gentleness and self-love, not looking in the mirror and saying my body's gorgeous, but finding worth in other places and seeing our bodies as, these vehicles that we live in. And then that will then transfer to other people. And then we can start doing some work outside of ourselves. It happens naturally. So whenever people get overwhelmed, I just bring them right back to kind of the internal revolution, because that is really where it starts.
Love that. Yeah.
That's
since
great.
Since you sort of brought up mental health a little bit, you for people who follow you on Instagram, you talk a lot about mental health. In your posts, you talk about it in your book. You've been very open about your mental health struggles. Can you tell us why you feel it's sort of important to share these struggles, these mental health struggles, and what you've seen is the benefit from doing that?
Yeah. So my background actually isn't behavioral health, mental health. I worked, it's been about 10 years, I think. So, I worked as a credentialed peer support specialist, as an educator, as a psychosocial rehabilitator in our mental health system here in Tucson. And I had no idea how interconnected they would be. And really, it's only been in the last couple years that I've really started to see how our our world is obsessed with physical health, right? Like when we say health, people think of
absolutely
physical health only. It goes straight to food and movement. That's health and blood tests. So it's so one-dimensional, our view of health. And what is underneath that iceberg is spiritual, emotional, behavioral, mental health, and all of those components. And that's really where I'm educated in a lot, and where I live most of the time, and something I'm really passionate about. And in the last couple of years, it's really become very clear to me. And I think I wrote an article on this. You can find it on my blog, and also I think on Ravishly. But the title is kind of what I believe, which is, if you want to talk about physical health, we're probably going to talk about mental health first. And if we want to talk about, physically enhancing your life, we're going to talk about mentally enhancing your life first, because it starts there. And what people don't realize, I think, a lot is a few things. One, our mental health is the thing that's ignored. We have so much, you can find anything on how to change your physical health online. Mental health is a little more elusive. We don't really talk about it, yet it's like kind of the source of everything. And we also don't realize, when we talk about the nervous systems and polyvagal theories, how connected our brains and our bodies are. And in this world, we really have had them kind of severed. So we have head doctors and we have body doctors. We have diet culture that teaches us to not trust our body. If it says it's hungry, it's probably lying. And so we create this disconnect where we don't even know how really to communicate with our body anymore. But our body is this living system made up of 1 million systems. And it works with our brain and when we look at it holistically, that's kind of where actual healing comes from. And I feel like I'm getting real fucking vague and weird right now. So I need you to ask me a question so that it like actually makes sense to folks who are listening. Can one of you do that?
Yeah. So the disparity between physical and mental health to me is really clear from my end as a dietitian. No one will reimburse me for someone coming to my office. Insurance won't reimburse me for a client coming to my office to treat their eating disorder from a nutritional standpoint. Like there's no value in that work from an insurance standpoint. And there's so many more insurance dollars if I counsel someone on a physical ailment, right? So the insurance disparity that I see all the time between mental health that people need a therapist, period.
I agree.
Right?
Yeah, good one.
You know, so that maybe that's the question is like, let's come at it from that angle, like who can get some sort of subsidized coverage, insurance coverage for mental health.
Right. And and there's so many insurance incentives too for only diagnosing weight in general as well. So I think if we look at it from a system standpoint, what you're saying is I can't bill for mental health, I can bill for physical. And within the physical, people can also just, bill for even just weight management talk, even just addressing something like that. So yes. But I think something that people don't realize, and I'll just end with this, is that there's this great book called The Body Keeps the Score.
Yeah.
And are you familiar with it?
I've heard of it, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. It's really phenomenal. And I think you don't have to read it to just just know that we store our history, our feelings, our emotions, everything that we are in us on a cellular level. So we tend to think of it as a very heady thing, but actually it's in our body too. So if we want to heal, it's a holistic approach that has to happen in order for actual healing to commence. It can't be just go into the doctors, get some sort of diagnosis and address it that way. It really has a lot to do with mental health, a lot to do with how we talk to ourselves. And that translates into our body as well. So it's all connected in summary. And mental health is just the thing that we never look at when we talk about health. And I really think that needs to change. We need to flip this on its head.
And I agree, because I think mental health doesn't get looked at until somebody can have a diagnosis. And the reality is mental health happens whether we have a diagnosis of something or whether we are diagnosable or not. And it's varying degrees of how we feel, right? So I'll have clients that are sort of talking about like, oh, I feel unhealthy, like they think they feel physically unhealthy. When I dive down a little bit, what they're actually feeling is mentally unhealthy about themselves. And then when we look further at, well, what can you do to help you feel better in your head as well as your body? It's really, the mental health is so connected to physical health. Like you can't, I really think it's almost impossible to separate them.
It is. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. We're glad you're talking about that.
I also think this is exactly, to me, like the thing that like brings it all together from what we just started talking about at the beginning of this episode is liberation. And I think if we think about, understanding how our body, like I love this book, by the way, Body Keeps the Score. I just finished reading it and just love it.
Cool.
Is this idea like of understanding trauma and understanding, how that affects our body and that affects our mental health, our physical health. And it's why, if we especially look at weight stigma, like why this word liberation, I think, is beginning to resonate with me so much as well. It is about, liberating ourselves from the past trauma and trying to make peace with, our bodies today and navigate a world that is oppressive. But how do we do it in a safer way that doesn't re-traumatize us? Right.
Exactly. My therapist is phenomenal and on the edge of a lot of really fascinating research. And she just mentions a lot that, we live in a trauma-based civilization. It's Simple as that. And we all experience it, whether it's walking out into 116-degree heat that we're not capable of, or systemic oppression where like we're discriminated against at work, or just conflict. Like we live in the midst of trauma and we experience it all the time. So how do we address that? How do we make it available to everyone? And mental health is really where that starts. And when you take care of that mental health aspect, it takes care of your physical aspect. And so for me, really, the turning point for me when it came to my own body journey was I had tried to fix my body for so long and ended up wrecking it in a lot of ways just because of dieting and the extreme measures I put it through. That I was tired of it and it wasn't working. I had done it for over a decade, 13 years, I think. And I was like, okay, it's time to focus on my brain. And little did I know, they're very connected, right? So they benefit. But I really did dedicate my time to relearning things, to processing that trauma, to healing my brain disorders around a lot of things. And I've seen that impact my physical health as well. So it's kind of a win-win.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
Well,
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 yeah,
I was
go
going
ahead,
to say this has been such a pleasure to hear from you and talk about these things. We're just so happy that you're able to come on. And I'm hoping that everybody will read your book. Where can people find you right now online?
So I have a blog. If they're looking for old writings, it's themilitantbaker.com. And I also work online doing body image and mental health coaching, and that's jesbaker.com. So both of those places.
Okay. Well, we will link to both those in our show notes. And are you still sort of touring and promoting the book, or are you getting to relax a little bit now, or what's happening with that?
I can't believe this, but it's been a year since Landwhale came out, which blows my mind. So, I'm in full summer here. It's like winter. It's in Tucson, where we all kind of just hibernate in the summer because it's so hot you can't leave your house. So I'm in hibernation mode, and I'm just like really enjoying working at home with people one-on-one and also doing some writing.
Awesome. And that's part of the caring for mental health, right? Mental and physical health. Like sometimes we just have to do a little less stuff. Well, I hope everybody gets your book after hearing this. I've really enjoyed reading it. I know Erin has too. Yeah, and we're just going to sort of keep our eye on you and see what else comes out in the future.
Yeah, thanks for being on the show. This is it's been a great conversation, so thank you.